I'm not surprised that they found a hole in the border area, and it's not really a hole. You know, this is a border of about 1,000 kilometers, and much of it, this is, in other words, between Ukraine and Russia, much of it is densely forested with rivers, hills, and there are many areas in Ukraine that simply don't have very many people living in them. Most of the population in Russia and Ukraine is concentrated, frankly, in the larger cities. Between the cities, the roads and bridges and so forth aren't always the best, but there are actually relatively few villages. In this particular area where they chose to penetrate, there was almost no one. And I think they had perhaps 50 policemen that were stationed in the area. So it was easy to penetrate, but they weren't able to achieve their objective. And their objective, as you know, was to reach Kursk and the Kursk nuclear power plant, ostensibly to capture it and hold it as a bargaining chip, presumably because the Russians have controlled the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant almost from the beginning of the war. And the Ukrainians thought that they could capture this thing and they might be able to make some capital out of it, or worse, they could cause an accident that would do enormous damage. In any case, they got about 25 miles and were stopped dead in their tracks as the Russians began assembling strike forces as well as maneuver forces to stop them.
Now, it's interesting in terms of what has happened, because this has been portrayed as a big embarrassment for the Russian side. And I think to a certain extent it probably is. But the Western media especially has been hyping this up, that this has changed the nature of the war. Now Russia's on its back foot. And there's actually people suggesting that Putin may now be forced to make a negotiated settlement because of this small incursion. I just, number one, on the surface of it just seems absurd in a 2.5-year war for one moment like this for people to think anything's going to happen. But part of that is fed because of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who the New York Times today published a part of a speech that he gave to a bunch of ambassadors to Ukraine, where he is basically saying the West and saying, hey, you guys are naive. In fact, this article, which came out just a couple of hours ago, says the whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled, past tense, these days, somewhere near Sudza. Mr. Zelenskyy told the Ukrainian ambassadors, Russia's slow response to Ukraine's incursion should signal to the world that Russia is not the fearsome superpower it once appeared to be. Mr. Zelenskyy noted it is time when the West is shredding its last and very naive illusions about Russia. He went on to say, also echoing something he wrote yesterday that was published in Politico, where he said, hey, fork over the weapons, man. We're doing great on all fronts, but you guys need to give us the weapons faster. And then he called out the United States, United Kingdom, and France by name and said, hey, man, let's go ponying up. I guess I just wonder, first of all, Doug, I guess your analysis of what Zelenskyy could be thinking, and what does he think he's going to get accomplished by this?
Is born every minute. And I think that Mr. Zelenskyy is very much in the Barnum category. He realizes he's dealing with a lot of suckers in the West, at least in part because, as Mike Benz and others has taught us, we're not getting the truth in the West about anything regarding Ukraine, or for that matter, anything that our respective governments don't want us to hear. And right now in Europe, as well as in the United States, we have official narratives that are picked up by the mainstream media and then essentially disseminated without question. And they're almost all false. There's very little truth in any of them. That's certainly the case here. Let's look at what has actually happened. The total number of forces that were involved in this on the Ukrainian side turned out to be about 12,000. Initially, 1,000 went in. They discovered how light the resistance was, and they poured in an additional 11,000 troops. Right now, we estimate that close to 3,500 to 4,000 have been killed or wounded. We now know that all of the heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, radars, missiles, everything that they brought with them has been destroyed. Most of it by Iskander missiles, a tactical ballistic missile system the Russians employ that carries about a 1,200-pound warhead, different kinds of warheads for different purposes, including fuel air explosive. These have annihilated all of the heavy equipment. At the same time, they moved to the area a number of Chechen forces on one side, Wagner military types on the other, and then the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps. They have cut the remaining Ukrainian troops off from their route that they were going to try to use to get back into Ukraine. So now, whatever is left of that 12,000, which is probably 4,000 or 5,000 uninjured with others scattered, is fighting for its very life as it's being systematically annihilated with strikes and maneuver forces. So this thing was a debacle. It was a catastrophe because they used whatever new equipment they had, and all of that is virtually gone right now. The sad part is they used a lot of Western equipment, including